Welcome to the Fathom webinar about how to design great open-ended questions and fabulous surveys with open ends in them that get you really rich verbatim responses. Again, my name is Tova. I'm one of the founders here at Fathom, and I'm going to kick it over to Michiah, who is my co-founder, who's going to lead us through this presentation today, and we'll circle back around at the end for questions. Over to you, Michiah.
Thanks, Tova, and thank you everyone for joining today. Really excited to go through a topic that's near and dear to my heart, having spent more than a decade as a researcher, which is around how to craft better open ends. I'm going to share a little bit more on the background we bring to that, not only processing a ton of text analytics data from open ends, but also being researchers ourselves. So just to give us a little bit of context as we dive in, I assume everyone here knows what Fathom does. We are the highest quality text analytics product for researchers. What makes us different is we are combining the most powerful AI in the world along with expert human supervision. And this provides a level of quality and particularly customization and detail of the coding of things like survey open ends or other kinds of text that is just much more accurate, much more customized, and much more precise than any other kind of solution. This exists in the Fathom dashboard. I'm going to give a quick little sort of snapshot of the platform at the end. And of course, please do reach out to us if you'd like to have a tour for yourselves. As a consequence, we get to work with some of the top researchers in the world. We've processed tens of millions of open-ended responses to date. We work with large brands like a Netflix or a Warby Parker. We work with large consultancies like a McKinsey or an FGS Global. And we work with lots and lots, particularly market research agencies and other, really sophisticated researchers looking to get that deeper understanding into the why that's informing their audiences on their most important questions. Now, one piece of context that some folks may or may not know is that before Fathom, Tova and I founded a different company. It was called Avalanche. And this is important because what we did at Avalanche was really focused on large-scale surveys with lots of open ends in them. And this was, started about 10 years ago and operated for 7 years before it was acquired. And in that business, we did large-scale surveys with lots of open ends to get at the richness and the why underneath some of the most difficult issues that we face. And so in that work, it gave us just a ton of time to test thousands and thousands of different ways of asking questions on some of the most complex and sophisticated topics and issues. And of course, analyzing those as well. And that experience turned into Fathom. And so I mentioned that today just briefly to say that not only do we come to this as the founders of Fathom, where we have a front row seat to being processing open ends from lots and lots of other researchers, but we've also done this ourselves. I believe we've probably crafted and run and fielded surveys that collected more open-ended data than any organization I know of in terms of the number of surveys on the number of issues. So a lot of experience here. And that means we tried a lot of things that didn't work and some things that did work. And so what I'm excited about today with this webinar is that we get to just give you the shortcut to the things that did work. And hopefully that saves you a ton of time and effort. And then we can collaborate on processing that data for you. And all of that is going to get you to much deeper insight much more quickly. So today's agenda, I'm going to try to cover a bit. My hope here is to make this as rich and valuable for you as possible. And so I'm going to try to fit a lot in. I'm also going to try to get us to a point where we have some time for questions at the end. So Tova mentioned, please do drop them into the chat as we go. Tova will just stop and yell at me if there's something urgent. Otherwise, we'll hold those questions to the end, and I'll make sure we have at least 10 minutes at the end, maybe a bit more for questions when we get there. So today, the agendas that we're going to go through here, the first thing that we're going to look at is categories of use cases for open ends. I think this is a topic that's often kind of skipped over. We just have open ends in certain places or not. But I want to start by talking about where are actually the kinds of use cases where across our research and across the millions of data points that we see from our customers, we see the highest value coming from open ends. And these are places where if you're not already using them, you really should be thinking about adding them. Now that the ability to process the responses is so easy and seamless with a tool like Fathom, these are areas you really want to be making sure that you are including those open ends. The next topic we're going to talk about is some rules for writing better open ends. Lots of survey questions have the property of, a bad question leads to bad data. Open ends are particularly that way. And there's some not necessarily intuitive rules that can help you write open ends that are going to perform vastly better in terms of answering your strategic questions compared to others. So we're going to share those with you as well, so you can be writing really high quality open ends. And then to make it as tangible as possible, I'm actually going to walk through some specific templates as well, where we're going to pull together those principles into what we call batteries. So a series of questions all connected together that you can mix and match. You can sort of drop other topics into, and it's going to perform really well for you. At the end, I'm going to show you actually just some example data. I'm going to use Fathom to do that. But the goal is really just to show you how better questions lead to better data, which leads to better insights. We're not going to have a lot of time, so that'll probably be quick. And I'm going to wrap up in time for us to have some questions. So let's dive in. One quick note, everything that I'm going to talk about today assumes what I call a fixed survey system, so a traditional survey tool where you write a single question and a respondent sees that question and answers it. That's for a couple of reasons. One is that type of system is typically used most frequently, even with the advent of AI probing systems. It also has the advantage of giving you exact control over what question is asked. And that actually has a lot of advantages, and it produces really consistent data. That said, we do process a lot of data from folks who are using AI probing tools. So this is a tool where you might ask an open end, a respondent gives an initial answer, and AI is used to follow up and ask a follow-up question of that respondent. And I just want to share, for the data that we are processing here, we have learned some really helpful things here. So this is something, please let me know if you'd like to talk about more, but use just a single follow-up if you can. Avoid probes that take the respondents in a bunch of different directions, because that's going to be hard to aggregate. And most importantly, everything I'm going to walk through today holds for probing systems as well. So you can take all the things that I'm going to talk about today and use that to guide either your static fixed survey tool or a dynamic probing system, either way. And again, if you want to talk about some of these more detailed experiences we've had around how exactly to get the most out of an AI probing system in terms of your data quality, give me a shout and I'm happy to talk through those as well. So let's go into the top three, I'm calling it categories of use cases. So these are sort of three types of strategic situations in which open ends can be uniquely powerful as a survey researcher. The first is revealing the behavioral or attitudinal drivers. This is really the classic sort of why question. So when we first started working with Netflix, they told us, look, we understand who will watch what better than any company in the world. And we have incredibly sophisticated data science that guides that recommendation engine and lets us understand who's going to watch what. And we have next to no idea why. And why people watch different kind of content is what they use a lot of qualitative and survey open ends to be able to understand. So it's why are people, in this case, watching different shows? But we have another customer who does this. They're a really sophisticated customer called Emerald Research. We have a case study with them if you want to see it. And they do a similar version of this with large technology companies, where they help them understand what's driving things like purchasing behavior on their platform. So they look at data around, say, people who are gamers on one of the largest gaming networks and systems in the world, and they look at what are the qualitative types of experiences that are highly correlated with spending time or even money on that platform. And this lets them understand and give recommendations back to this technology company around, hey, here are the types of qualitative user experiences, in this case, the types of experiences gamers are having, that we can understand through survey open ends because of their richness and their open-ended nature. But because of the rigor of Fathom, because of the detail that we're able to code with, they can actually do really sophisticated statistical analysis to understand what are the qualitative types of experiences that are driving either user engagement or purchasing behavior on a platform. So those are some commercial examples. We also see this a lot in the civic space when people are looking at, what drives candidate approval or what drives voting behavior or any of those other types of things. Again, you're looking for that deeper why. And this is an area where when we get into crafting the open ends and how to do that best, a lot of them are going to adhere very quickly to this kind of use case, because I think it's the one where most researchers off the bat say, okay, this is where I should be using my open ends. In particular, we see cases around, NPS or other types of customer insights feedback, what's driving high NPS, what's not, what's driving usage or not, what's driving cancellation, content messaging, and civic action. Now, another area that I think is sort of the next most common that we see is what I call emotional and conceptual associations. So one of the most interesting thing about open ends is that it creates a space where you can let people do free association. And this can be a really powerful way to understand what really drives behavior in whether it's voters or consumers or users, which is how they really feel about things. And getting a sense of those emotional drivers can be really, really difficult in traditional closed-ended quantitative research. But if we imagine, for example, say a brand researcher at Tesla right now, I promise you there is someone there who is asking questions like, what comes to mind when you think of Tesla right now? And that kind of open-ended question is going to generate really powerful data. What emotion do you feel when you think about Tesla? Those kinds of open-ended questions are really, really powerful ways. I used to work in civic research. I had one of my mentors in that space. He used to like to ask a question when doing research around political candidates, where he would ask, when you think of this candidate or when you see this candidate in a clip, what animal do you think best describes them? Which is this kind of quirky question, but it actually becomes a really interesting way to see what are kind of the archetypes of personalities that people are associating someone with. So those kinds of free form questions can be really, really powerful way to get under the hood a little bit on what people are feeling and associating at a deeper level as well. And we'll go through some more examples like that. Obviously, we see this a lot in brand management. We also see it a lot in message and content testing, where tone really matters and connecting with people on the right tone of where they are. So understanding what emotion do you feel when you think about this issue, and how do I match to that emotion in a way that's going to resonate? We see this a lot around leadership perception, whether it's in the corporate world or the political world. What comes to mind when you think of, a given candidate? How do you feel when you think about a given candidate? What qualities do you like? What qualities do you not like? Those kinds of open-ended issues, and all the same kinds of questions around issue advocacy as well. So these kind of open-ended associations, really, really powerful to get at those emotional and conceptual drivers. The third broad category of use cases that we see open ends, and we did a whole webinar on this back in December, is they're especially powerful for navigating uncertain times. So when the world is changing quickly, you literally don't know what multiple choice response options to provide in your question, and being able to just ask, what are you worried about? What do you think should be done? How is this issue impacting you? Those kinds of open-ended questions are uniquely powerful when the world is changing really quickly. And it's also a really powerful way to know when the world is changing quickly. So Gallup famously asks a question across the world that's along the lines of, what do you think is the most important issue facing the country? And of course, they do that as an open end, because people can mention anything that comes up. And so if you look at their data for the last couple of years, you'll see a spike in inflation. And the way they track that is literally just people started mentioning the word inflation in that open end. And it's a much more dynamic way to track that than keeping a static list of 25 issues and trying to change it over time and so on and so forth. So these open ends can be really powerful in times of uncertainty, both to understand what is switching. So by using open-ended questions, what are you worried about? What's on your mind? What do you think are the top issues? As a way to sort of have an open-ended listening for how is the world changing is really powerful. And then as you see that it is, those open ends become particularly powerful to navigate them. So we partnered with a large number of folks on research in the early days of COVID. And this was a time where there was absolutely no precedent for this issue. No one even knew what questions to ask. And so we were really effective in working with our partners on crafting these open-ended questionnaires, starting as simply in the early days with, how is this impacting your life? What are you worried about? What are you hopeful for? Who do you blame? Who do you trust? This type of open-ended listening was incredibly powerful to just get a landscape analysis of how is this issue unfolding and how are people experiencing it. So we see this type of issue, particularly in rapid reaction to unprecedented events, but also that open-ended listening letting you know, being sort of an early warning system for when things are coming up. So brands will use this in brand tracking, people in issue tracking and public opinion polling, obviously, the Gallup example, using this to keep an eye on things. And then, of course, we see a lot of use in this in sort of the PR and crisis communication space. Some type of issue or event comes up, and you need to very quickly understand how people are reacting to something in real time. That can be really, really critical. So 3 use cases that we've talked about here. These may be somewhat obvious on the face of them, but I really encourage you to kind of step back and think about where in your research or where in your upcoming research Are you really sort of facing a blocker on these things? And you need to get to that deeper level of really understanding the why, understanding what's really driving the behavior here. I know the what, but I don't know the why. What are the drivers? What are the emotional and conceptual components that are making people feel a certain way? And we know those feelings are what really drive behavior. And then where are the areas where, and there are many right now, things are changing rapidly and quickly, and we really need that real-time sense so that we can keep a pulse on things as well. These are the areas where I would really encourage you to think about where can we be adding some open ends, or perhaps refining the ones you already have based on the guidance that we're going to provide here in a moment, that's going to give you much richer insight. And now that there are tools like Fathom that can seamlessly process that data for you, you no longer have the barrier of not wanting to use these open ends because they typically historically have been a headache to deal with. So those are the top three categories. The next thing that I want to go into is around rules for writing better open ends. And so this, I think, is sort of my favorite area because Tova and I and our team at Avalanche spent just a tremendous amount of time. And part of what we had the luxury of doing was just trying a lot of different stuff. And so what I'm going to talk about here is the result of testing on survey platforms with real respondents, thousands and thousands of ways of asking different kinds of questions. You can imagine, particularly a why question. We tested lots of ways to ask that. And spoiler, the best way to ask why is not by just asking why. Turns out not such a good way to do it. So let's get into what is good. The first thing is to be specific and focused. So this might seem a little counterintuitive because I think a lot of people, they think of open ends as, well, this is the place where I can be really open-ended. I can be really broad. And so I want to be as broad as I can be and just let people answer however they answer. That actually leads to a lot of problems. In particular, it leads to ambiguity for the respondent, and it leads to very fractured data files and response patterns. So a good open-end focuses the respondent on what I call a strategic point of feedback. And I'll explain what I mean by that in a second. But just to start at the top here, the first thing just to watch out for is oftentimes an open end is kind of a catch-all for a team that's writing a survey. So we might just include an open end at the end of the respondent saying, like, is there anything else on your mind that you'd like to tell us? And let's just see what comes up. I think there are various team dynamics why that can happen, but it is very rare that that leads to anything helpful. Because it is so broad, it leads to very, very vague types of responses and people answering it in very, very many different ways. What you want instead is an open end that has enough focus to it that you know every respondent is going to answer it in a similar kind of way. And it's actually a relatively easier type of question to answer. I'm going to show you a bunch of examples of that in a moment. A couple things just to get the nitty gritty out of the way. So be really careful about ambiguity. There are hundreds of questions that we tested as a team where we thought, there's only one way to interpret this open end. We are asking, why do you feel that way about the ad? And it turns out some people were reacting to the content of the ad, and some people took the question as, what about me personally makes me like it? And they were telling stories about themselves. And so we thought we were being precise. It turned out actually, why do you like this ad is a pretty vague question. You can take it in a bunch of different directions. So a little bit of pre-testing, if you're not using the templates that we're providing here, can be really helpful to keep an eye on, are people interpreting this the same way or not? And you want the answer to be yes for the very vast majority of people. Definitely watch out for double barrels. They are really tricky. So a simple, a small version of this might be like, do you have any other concerns? If so, what are they? That is not great because some people are going to say yes and some people are going to say yes and an issue, and you don't know what the issue was for the people who just said yes. It becomes a bit of an issue. We see even more heinous versions of this where it really is just completely separate questions sort of jammed into one, and that creates a data file where you just don't know what the answer is to, and that becomes pretty much useless. So really watch out for that. And finally, I want to focus back to this idea of focusing your questions on actual points of feedback. So I'm going to go to the ad testing example here. If we showed an ad to a set of respondents and we asked, did you like it or not? And for the people who did like it on some score, we said, why did you like it? As I mentioned a moment ago, we're going to get lots of different responses that are not actually about the ad. They're about the person's experience and what they like or don't like in the world. And that's not actually something you can do anything about. You don't have actionable leverage over how someone grew up or where they live or those types of things. It might be kind of interesting, but it's not actually actionable. If you think about an ad testing environment, the choices you can actually inform are, what do we keep, change, or cut in this ad, right? And so if those are the decision points that you can be driving your research toward, then you want to focus your questions towards that. In particular, what part of this ad did you like the most or dislike the most? By focusing from why did you like it to what part, we now have focused the open end on what's really actionable for us, which is what's the part of this we're going to keep or we're going to cut. And that becomes much, much more actionable. It's still open-ended, but it's focused in on the point of feedback that actually relates to your goal. So I'll give you lots more examples of this, but as we talk about going from really, really open-end to more narrow questions, a lot of it is narrowing in on the types of feedback that are actually most actionable based on the type of strategic context and what kind of actions you're informing. I find the best metaphor to think about this is effectively a spectrum of open-endedness, if you will. And so on sort of the narrowest end of the spectrum, you can have an open-ended question like, do you like cats? That technically you could make this an open-ended question, but the universe of potential answers is so narrow that you really might as well just make it a closed end. There's nothing useful to be gained by making it open-end. On the other end of the spectrum are incredibly broad types of questions. We've talked about a couple of them already, and interestingly, why is pretty far on that spectrum. And there are a lot of issues with too broad that I'm going to talk about, but in particular, people answer them lots of different ways because they interpret them lots of different ways, and many of those ways are not relevant to your research goals. And so it just gives you a lot of noise relative to the signal you're looking for. And so my number one conceptual piece of guidance for writing better open ends is to focus on what I sometimes call semi-constrained, or other people on our team call focused open questions that are in this middle ground where it's open-ended. You're going to have all the benefits of finding things you didn't know to look for, but at the same time, you're focusing respondents on the points of feedback that are most actionable. So in the example we just talked about, which part of this ad do you like the most or like the least? That is going to give them the opportunity to talk about all sorts of things. It has that benefit of open-endedness. You can never ask that question in a multiple choice format in a way that was going to work very well. But at the same time, you're guiding the respondents towards the actionable type of feedback that's going to be most helpful for you. So really think about this spectrum as you're writing your questions, and how can you focus in on this middle ground of focused open questions. A few examples here, and I can go through a ton more examples as we get going through the rest of these. But over here on the left, we have some that I would describe as vague and broad, and they're typically going to give you not that helpful of data files. So is there anything else you'd like to share is sort of my number one pet peeve in surveys, because there are just so many different directions this can go, and a bunch of people will ignore it, and you end up with a list of stuff that is really just not very helpful. If we imagine this as say an employee feedback type of a scenario, you could much more easily focus that and say, well, what we really want to know is, are there other kinds of maybe bad experiences that employees have had? Like maybe that's what is actually behind this question. If so, then let's focus it. Is there anything else we could do to improve your experience, right? This is going to still give us a lot of open-ended value in terms of finding things we might not have caught in the rest of the survey didn't come up, but it's now narrowing down on what are some problems we can solve, because that's actually what we want to identify here, right? Similarly over here, why is a given issue important for you? That why question, people can answer that a lot of different ways, and as I'll talk about in a moment, that's actually a pretty hard question to answer well. A much easier question to answer is, well, okay, what I really want to know is how this issue impacts people, because then I can talk about that issue to that audience in a way that resonates with them. So why don't I just ask that? In what specific ways does that issue impact you and your community? Now you're telling me stories about how you experience this issue. That's a really good way for me to get an understanding of why this matters to you, because I understand how exactly it impacts you, right? And it's a much easier, much more precise question for a respondent to handle. Similarly, just getting into what really is our whole next section around how you can modify why questions is anchoring on these particular parts of strategic actionability. So instead of why, what's the most important part? What's the most important reason? What's the most important quality? These are all going to anchor in different ways on different theories of what's strategically important to you. And that's a good segue into our next piece of guidance, which is To the extent that thinking about that spectrum feels a little, difficult and it's not quite super clear, a great shortcut to that is to replace the why with the what in writing your questions. Now, this might sound a little bit funny because this whole topic started because I have great quantitative research, I understand the what, and I don't understand the why. And so now I want to ask open-ends to understand the why. And now I'm telling you the best way to understand why is by asking what. Turns out it's weird, but it's very true. So there are a few reasons why often fails. I've touched on them in different places, but I think this is just worth going into the weeds for just a minute about, because I think the more that you think about this as a researcher, the more that understanding really helps you creatively drive better kinds of questions. So I've talked already in a number of examples about how why is intrinsically vague. There's just a bunch of different sort of theories of motivation and action that a person can have to answer that question. And I've also talked about how it doesn't really focus the person on necessarily the most actionable levers of feedback. So in the ad testing example, it doesn't focus them on, okay, but what are the parts of the ad that you liked or didn't like? They might be talking about other versions of why that are just not actually actionable and helpful for you. The third one, and this is sort of the wonkiest one, but I think is worth thinking about actually, is that when we ask why, it actually requires a respondent to have their own causal model of why they do things. And that's actually pretty hard. It's both cognitively difficult and people are pretty bad at it. So a famous example is if you ask someone, why did you vote or not vote? They're incredibly bad at answering that in a way that conforms at all to the data that predicts why or why not people vote. Similarly, why do you approve or not approve of a given candidate? Why do I like someone or not? I'm actually pretty bad at answering that in a clear-cut way. What you can do instead is substitute your own causal model, give your causal model over to the respondent by saying to yourself, okay, I think the qualities of a leader are a good, one of the important indicators of whether or not people like them. So instead, I'm going to ask, what qualities do you like about this person? That's a much easier question for someone to answer. They're not having to come up with their own theory of why. And you actually get the benefit of inserting yours in, and that will help you in terms of testing down the road. So if this resonates with you, give it some thought, go down that track. If it doesn't resonate with you, the important thing here is to replace why with what to get much more actionable insight. It's going to force you, by shifting to what terminology, it's going to force you to say, instead of why do you like this candidate, saying, okay, what specific qualities, what actions, what things have they said, what have you heard about them? That's going to help you get your own theory more precise. It's also going to give the respondent a much more coherent experience that's much easier for them to answer. And because your respondents are now all answering a more narrow focused, for example, what qualities do I like about this person? If you have 1,000 respondents, you're just going to get a list of qualities. And that's going to lead to a much more powerful data set for the kinds of analysis that we can support you with at Fathom. A few examples here. So I think this is probably one of the most kind of interesting key slides to come back to as you're thinking about, okay, how do I update my language and my open ends, is just going from the why to the what. So over here, we've got one around, why do you like that brand? Let's say we were doing the Tesla brand tracking and we said, do you have a positive or negative feeling towards Tesla? And okay, some people have a positive. We ask why. It's not going to work so well for all the reasons we've mentioned. Something more precise might be, what specifically do you like most about their products? What specifically do you like about the company? What specifically do you like about your experience with them? Those kinds of things are going to get a lot more focused. Similarly, a kind of an NPS type of a question, why are you unlikely or likely to recommend us? Not as actionable, not as straightforward as something like, what happened that makes you unlikely to recommend us? What specific bad experience did you have? Or perhaps even following that, how could we do better next time? What specifically could we do to improve your experience? Those kinds of questions are going to be much more actionable. We talked about an approval example. So what specific quality makes you approve or disapprove of that business or political leader that you might be researching? Issues. So, lots of people on the call today are dealing with public opinion issues in various spaces. So why is a complex issue like the economy or the environment or climate change or anything like that important to you? Pretty hard to answer for a bunch of reasons. a much more straightforward question: what specific way does this issue impact your life? And that might not be the only one. You might sort of decompose a why question into: how does this impact your life? How does it impact your community? What do you hope should be done? Who do you blame? Like, all those kinds of open ends can be really helpful to decompose a really complex why into a set of much more specific, more focused open ends that are going to give you a much clearer map of what's going on. Third point of recommendation here is to combine your open ends with closed ends, and to use branching to then make your open ends even more focused and precise. So we often, in this kind of format, will use kind of an attitudinal type of a Likert scale question. Do you approve or disapprove? Maybe an NPS question. Did you have a positive or negative experience? And then based on that score, we can then branch to focus more precise open ends. So to switch to the NPS kind of an example, we can branch and have a different open end for people that are detractors, a different open end for promoters, and a different open end for neutrals. And that's going to let us get a much more focused question, and that's going to lead to much more actionable data. You can then, of course, just to mention here, combine, I mentioned Emerald Research and others who then combine that data with other types of telemetry data. So maybe I'm looking at usage data and purchase behavior, or I'm looking at voting patterns or donation patterns, to then understand, okay, which of these types of qualitative experiences are driving not only an approved, disapproved score or a high, low NPS score, but are actually driving purchasing, cancellation, the actual kind of behavioral metrics that we really care about at the end of the day. So a quick example here, just using an NPS, and this is simplified just down to detractors and promoters, but we see a ton of data sets that are in this format over here. We ask your straight up NPS: how likely are you to recommend us to a friend or colleague? And then they follow up and say, why did you give that score? And so the same wording is going to everybody, irrespective of whether they are a promoter or a detractor. And so you get a pretty muddy, unfocused data set. And particularly if you're trying to code it all into a single code frame, you're going to lose a lot of fidelity and a lot of detail. You get tremendously more insight if you use a little bit of branching logic to ask some different questions. So perhaps of the detractors, we ask, what's something we could change that would make you more likely, right? And this is a good example of anchoring on a strategic point of feedback. In this case, we might decide what we really want to know from our detractors is how we can do better next time. Another theory of the case might be, what we really want to know is what created that negative experience so that we can fix it. So I could ask here instead, what specific negative experience did you have that makes you unlikely to recommend us? And maybe ask both of those in sequence. So what negative experience did you have, and how could we do better next time following that? Similarly, on the promoter side, I want to have a theory of the case of what do I really want to know from my promoters? In this case, the theory of the case is that I want to know the things that we should definitely not change, because maybe we're a rapidly evolving company and we don't want to lose the things that our current people love. And so in this case, we're asking, what's the most important thing to keep the same so that you keep recommending Fathom in the future? But again, you could have different theories of the case for your promoters. You could say, what can we do even better that would make you even more likely? But all of these more focused and more specialized follow-ups are going to lead to much, much more insightful responses that are going to lead to much more powerful data sets by way of just branching your open ends off those key closed-end variables in your data set. So perhaps the most frequent recommendation that I make of many of our largest customers and biggest brands is to go from this world to this world, where you take whatever your big tracking survey is, and I know it's a bunch of work, and I know you've got a bunch of infrastructure around it, but if you can just branch these questions that are in your key trackers and data sets, you're going to get tremendously more powerful data, especially if you have a tool like Fathom to be able to seamlessly process that with a tremendous amount of detail and accuracy. So one bonus I want to throw out here. So one of the things that we found at Avalanche is that in testing thousands and thousands of questions, we tried a lot of different tones. We tried sort of a very proper academic survey tone. We tried very colloquial tones. And what we found, to the surprise of absolutely nobody, is that sounding like a real human is really, really powerful. And in fact, it can be a powerful way with both that tone, but also the focus that we provided to make a question easier to answer. What we found is that good open ends actually increase completion rates. This probably sounds crazy. Maybe you don't believe me, but we've tested this at scale, and we have found that particularly in customer insights or other types of cases, a good open-ended question that actually shows like, hey, we actually care what you think, and we're humans and we want to know how we can do better next time or even better next time, actually really encourages people to talk, because when people think you actually care what they think, it turns out they're actually pretty open to sharing, and it maybe makes them feel good actually to share. And so I just wanted to add sort of as a layer over everything here that when we're looking at these open ends, they're a great opportunity to stand out by sounding more human, by showing that you actually care. And part of that can actually be a little bit of explaining why you're asking, not spending a paragraph explaining why. So I'll give you a couple examples. So over here, we have kind of a standard why follow-up to a healthcare issue. So maybe we did a survey and we had 1 to 5. How important is healthcare as an issue to you? Or how important do you think it is to the country? And then we follow up and we say, why is that an important issue, right? So standard question over here. It has all the sort of vague issues that we talked about, but it's also pretty cold and pretty onerous to answer. It honestly feels a little exhausting just reading this and saying, oh my God, where do I even start? Like, there are so many reasons I could answer. This is overwhelming. Maybe I'll just skip it. A much higher performing question, and we have quantitative data to back this up, is one that might sound a little bit funny. In fact, we didn't, Tova came up with this, and I didn't think it was going to work. It actually works really, really well. And it is, tell me something about you and your experience with issue to help me understand why you feel that way. And there's a bunch of things going on here. But I would say overall, part of what it shows is I want to understand you and I want to understand this issue, and I genuinely care. And it has a really powerful ability to solicit actual stories of experience. And we had a theory of the case that I think proved to be true again and again at Avalanche, that understanding these stories of how people experience things is a really powerful lever, whether it's in the civic space or the corporate space, in terms of really understanding what's going on behind a very complex thing like the healthcare system. Understanding the stories of how people interact with that, very powerful. And if you ask a human question, you would be surprised how frequently you will get human answers. Another version that's a little bit more in the corporate space. This is, an NPS branch here. Why would you not recommend our product? Again, the why is kind of overwhelming, and you're not exactly screaming that you actually give a crap what the person says. A better response is, we're really sorry you had that bad experience, and we want to learn how to do better. What specific experience did you have that made you feel that way? Right? And so this little paragraph, I think some survey methodologists would say, cut it, it's taking reading time, it's going to decrease your complete rate, so on and so forth. Our experience has been this kind of language is really, really helpful to not only give you better, more richer responses, but actually increase response rates, because people actually think you care and they're volunteering their time to give you some information. And we found in our testing that this was one of the highest predictors of whether or not people would really engage with the survey, is whether or not they thought there was a real person on the other end and whether that person actually gave a crap about the information that they share. So across all of the sort of specific tactical advice that we give, I really encourage you to think about maybe giving yourself a little more freedom to do this. One final side note here is, in an interesting way, a lot of the AI interactive tools are kind of trying to do this because the interactive chatbot, and that can work well sometimes and other times not so well. So I would say, to the extent that that is consistent with your brand, really sounds authentic, really sounds good, I think that can work well. I also think I've seen a number of those tools, and we have customers that use some of those tools, where that AI probing actually kind of backfires, because it feels like this isn't actually a person, it's a robot interviewing me, and I'm actually less likely to share. So just keep an eye on that as you're playing with different types of tools. So just a quick recap here. In terms of our top 3 rules for writing better open ends, be specific and focused. So think back to that spectrum from really closed-ended, do you like cats or not, all the way down to, is there anything else you'd like to share? Try to find that middle ground. There's a focused open end, still giving you the ability to find lots of things you didn't know to expect, but focusing on the strategic points of feedback. A very tactical way to do that is to replace the why in your question with what, and that what is going to force you to get clear about what are the points of feedback that are most helpful for you. And then finally, branching off your closed ends where possible, where you have some kind of positional score, is going to be really helpful to let you focus that open end even more into the drivers of positive or neutral or negative opinions or behaviors as well. So I wanted to give you just a few examples that put this all together in each of the categories. And then we're going to go ahead and give you just a quick preview of Fathom. And then we should have at least 10 minutes or so for questions. So the first kind of putting it together example that I'm going to give you is in brand tracking. And I'm going to give you 3 of these, and I'm calling them a template because we found at Avalanche that you could actually take this sequence of questions that I'll talk through in a second, and you could pretty easily drop in different, in this case, issues, brands, or leaders. And you could also sort of add or remove different components. So it's intended as something that's pretty modular. And so you could use this exactly as it is, or you could tweak it very easily. So in the brand or issue tracking space, you want to know conceptual associations, a flow that we've used in the past, and I'll use just Tesla as an example here. I typically want to start very open-ended, avoid priming effect, all that kind of thing. So before doing an approval question, I would just ask, what word or phrase first comes to mind when you think of Tesla? Again, we test a lot of questions to understand emotions. This one might seem simple, but is incredibly powerful. What emotion best describes how you feel when you think about Tesla? The little kind of internal diagnosis, that moment that happens when the respondent says, what emotion do I feel? Really powerful, actually. Not only in terms of getting a nice consistent data set, but you'll get really interesting nuances between subtly different emotions. This can be just a really powerful way. I think this is a much more robust way to measure emotional association than anything in the sentiment analysis zone. I'm happy to have a long debate with anyone about it. But asking people to actually self-diagnose their emotional association, very, very powerful. From there, maybe you want something that's a little bit of kind of a public discourse or a media monitoring type of a question. What have you heard recently? This question, I think, can be, you can take it or leave it depending on your context. If you are in the news a lot and you're a big brand like a Tesla, this might make sense. If you're not, maybe not. If you do ask that question, you could branch off it. So if yes, what specifically have you heard? And you're going to get some nice insights of what's kind of breaking through, not just what's in the news coverage, but what are people actually remembering and recalling. And then finally, at the end, just not to lose track of it, we of course want to compare this with some quantitative metrics. I would ask that at the end to avoid priming effects. But in this case, I can then do some interesting slicing and dicing here. In Fathom, I'd be able to look at, okay, what are the emotional associations that correspond to positive or negative views? Same with phrases that come to mind. I could slice and dice and say, well, okay, here's the emotional and conceptual associations for people who do like Tesla, for neutrals, and for those who don't. And that's going to give me a really clear sense of what are the associations that are driving emotions that are leading to a negative perception. If I was managing a brand, that's something I would care a lot about. And this very simple battery is going to give you a really powerful map to navigate that that's much richer than just straight up quantitative data. But here, just in 5 or 6 questions, I'm able to get an incredibly rich canvas of associations to a brand. NPS template, so we hinted at this before. Again, there's a number of different ways to do this. I've crammed 3 just barely on this part of this slide to show you something that looks split across, in this case, promoters. So, you give Fathom a high score. Again, trying to be human here, we're thrilled you recommend us. What's the most important thing for us to keep? I think I showed you that before. Here's a version of a neutral question where I might say something like, sounds like there's room for us to improve. What specifically can we improve to make you more confident recommending us in the future? Again, this is a particular theory of the case that what I want to do with my neutrals is build on success or solve barriers that they might be facing to move them up that ladder of satisfaction. And then similarly for those who had a bad experience, really owning that and asking what can be changed in the future so that we can address and solve those problems so that those don't persist in the future for them or other users. So here we're seeing branching, we're seeing a much more human tone, and we're seeing moving from a why to a what all at play in this single question here as well. Finally, an example in the navigating uncertainty space. So this comes from a survey that we ran as Avalanche in the early days of COVID, when literally no one had any idea what was going on from a public opinion and public health standpoint. And so one of the first surveys that we ran nationally, right as the pandemic was declared, was really geared at trying to understand how people were experiencing the challenge, not just what was in the news, but what were people experiencing. And so in this case, this battery starts with, what's the greatest challenge that COVID creates for your family? And then we were really interested in sort of how people perceive different actors. There were a number of different questions that fit in between these, but eventually we asked, who do you think is most to blame? We also had a question, who do you trust, as well? And then we moved into a place around more of a sort of positional score. Once we got through those open-ended associations, it gave us a map of what are people worried about, who they trust, who do they blame. We also were able to then, get into some positionals around, okay, do you think the government's doing a good or bad job? And then what specifically do you think they are doing that makes you feel either of those two things? Again, this could be segmented in 3 if you wanted, as well. And again, lots of other questions were included there to get at more of that just open-ended, what's going on in a rapidly changing environment. And what we found was that we repeated the survey over time, we were able to track. So, we could see how impacts to people were tracking and shifting over time as the pandemic unfolded. We could see how who they trusted, who they blamed really shifted from sort of their neighbors that they trusted, but also blamed, to more figures of authority that they both trusted and blamed, and sort of how that whole story unfolded. Really, really important to be able to connect with people in a moment of uncertainty when there's so much on the line. So the final thing that I want to show you is just a quick example of how good open ends lead to better data, and better data leads to more insight. I think we know this very sort of intuitively. This is a truism of research, but it is especially true with open ends. And so I'm going to show you a quick data set that goes back to a project we collaborated with a polling firm called Civics, and this goes back to the presidential debate last summer. And this is sort of a classic case of looking for a rapid response to an emerging issue. So we wanted to know what were perceptions and reactions that Americans had in relation to the debate. Obviously, closed-ended questions, not going to be super helpful. But even I'd say kind of a traditional open-ended approach here might be to say something like, who won the debate and why? And we thought that was going to be less helpful for all the reasons that we've talked about. And so we ended up collaborating and processing a bit of a different question. And I'm going to switch over to the Fathom platform just to give you a sense of what that was. So for folks who are familiar with our platform, this will make sense. For folks, this is your first time, please let us know either in the survey that we run here at the end or just in the chat if you'd like to have a demo, and I'll slow down and take you through this in a lot more detail. But here we're just looking at the results for this one data set. And there's a number of questions in here. We've got what do you think was the most significant single moment of the debate? So this is a great example of a what question instead of a why question that let us understand across parties, across all sorts of demographic groups, what really stood out to people. And then we did a version of, this is a little different than what we talked about, but this is also something we've tested very well, which is how would you describe a given candidate's performance in tonight's debate? So in this, what do you think is the most significant moment of the debate? Compare that in your mind to what you might get if you had just asked, why did X person win or lose the debate? In this case, we're going to get a very specific set of moments in the debate. And if we just switch over here and have a read through the raw data itself before I show you the results, we can see that that is very much true. This focused what question that says, what's the most important moment in the debate, gives us, unsurprisingly, a very clear but also very precise set of particular moments in the debate. And this then becomes a really powerful data set because it can be coded and analyzed so clearly and consistently with a tool like Fathom. We're able to say, okay, what are all the moments of the debate? And we can classify them, categorize them, and then map those against different kinds of fields. If we think about what something like why might yield, why would have a lot more noise in it here around pre-existing conceptions about the candidates or beliefs about American values or all sorts of other things would fall into this. Instead, we're getting a nice, clear perception of actual reactions to the debate itself, a much cleaner signal on that, and that's what we want. And so we can see how this kind of a clear, focused data set, as I switch over into actually looking at the themes that we're able to generate out of that, one of the things I mentioned at the top is that Fathom is a human-in-the-loop system. And so just to quickly describe, these dark bars are nets or higher level themes, and these light bars or child or more detailed themes, depending on your terminology. And so one of the things that our human-in-the-loop system allows is very contextually adaptive coding. So if you look at this higher level theme, Harris fading Trump's weaknesses, there's all these very particular moments in that debate that conceptually fit under that category. There's no AI system in the world that 2 hours after the debate would know all of these things conceptually match this category, right? And so this is the kind of thing that a human in the loop system is able to do. And it's really important in this case to understand this kind of higher level theme in terms of understanding what the reactions were. And of course, we can click in and get the raw responses here to any of the questions to confirm the validity and accuracy of the coding. So again, ensuring that human in the loop approach. And again, please do let me know if you'd like a demo. I can go ahead and give you a lot more of a sense of the automated reporting here that we're able to provide and support, as well as a lot of the segmentation and statistical analysis is actually built in. So if we want to see how responses vary by gender, we can see that right away with a highlighted comparison where the themes are statistically different and a summary of how those variations pan out statistically as well. So just want to draw the connection between a really focused question, like when you're able to drill down to what do you think is the most significant moment, you're able to get a lot more clarity and consistency in the code frame and the themes itself, and that leads to more rigorous analysis that you're able to do in a tool like Fathom that has a human in the loop and has a statistical analysis built into a single package for you. So with 7 minutes to spare, I think I'll leave it there and would love to invite questions that folks might have. And as I mentioned, please do answer the survey and give me a shout. Happy to do a full demo. I know a lot of folks get to the end of our webinars and they say, I love the info, but I want to know about the tool. We try to make it as content focused for you so that you get as much value as you can. So please do let me know and we can take a tour through the tool.